I set down my fork, looked my mother-in-law right in the eye across her perfectly set dining table, and said, "Then I suppose I'll just move back into my own place." And that's when my husband looked at me like I'd grown a second head and said, "What do you mean your own place?" That moment, that specific silence that followed, is something I still think about, not with anger anymore. More like the way you remember the exact second before a thunderstorm hits. Everything quiet, everything about to change. My name is Ardith and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, which is not a city people write poems about. It's a mining town that got cleaned up and tried to reinvent itself, and honestly I respect that about it. My mom raised my younger brother, and me mostly on her own after my dad left, when I was 9. She worked dispatch for a trucking company for 22 years. She made do, she taught me to make do, and she taught me very quietly to always keep something in reserve. I studied environmental science at Laurentian, not because I had some grand vision for my career, but because I genuinely love the land up there, the boreal forest, the lakes, the way the rock looks in October when the birches have gone gold. I ended up pivoting into environmental consulting after a year, doing field work for a government monitoring contract. The money wasn't spectacular, but I was careful with it. I always had been. When I was 26, I bought a small bungalow in the east end of Sudbury. Nothing impressive, 3 bedrooms, older kitchen, a yard with a garage. I paid $187,000 for it. My brother thought I was being boring. My mom cried a little, the good kind. I met my husband at a conference in Toronto. He was there representing his family's construction company, which had been doing commercial and residential builds across northern Ontario for 30 years. He was charming and loud, and laughed at everything, and I found that exhausting and completely irresistible in equal measure. We dated long distance for 8 months. He proposed on a dock at his parents' cottage near Parry Sound. I said yes. His mother, I'll call her what my husband calls her, which is Mom, though that word has always felt strange in my mouth when directed at her, had strong opinions about most things. Strong opinions about where we should live, which was not Sudbury. Strong opinions about what kind of wedding we should have, which was large. Strong opinions about when we should have children, which was soon. She delivered all these opinions warmly, with a smile, in the tone of someone sharing helpful observations rather than issuing directives. It took me a while to understand that the warmth was load-bearing, that it was doing a lot of structural work. We moved into the main house, not a separate unit. The actual family home in North Bay, a 4-bedroom place his parents had mostly stopped using since they'd bought a newer house on the other side of town. My husband's family owned it outright. His mother handled the property, she said, as part of the broader family portfolio. I didn't love the arrangement, but my husband was convincing about it being temporary, about how we'd find our own place soon, about how it was practical while his role in the company was still being formalized. I'd rented out my Sudbury bungalow to a young teacher and her partner. The rental income was modest but steady. The first several months were fine, in the way that things can be fine while also being quietly wrong. My mother-in-law came by several times a week. She had a key which I'd known about going in. She would rearrange things in the kitchen when she visited, not in a malicious way, just in the way of someone who didn't really register that the kitchen now belonged to someone else. I mentioned it to my husband. He said she meant well. She started making comments about my work schedule. I worked from home 3 days a week and drove to client sites the other 2. She seemed vaguely suspicious of the days I worked from home, as though I might be napping. She made remarks about how I should be building relationships in the North Bay community, getting involved, joining things. I joined a trail running group. She said she'd meant something more like the ladies' auxiliary at their church. And then, in the 3rd month, she sat me down at that same dining table and told me she thought it was time to formalize the living arrangement. I asked her what she meant. She said that they'd been generous in letting us use the house, but that carrying a property wasn't free. Insurance, property taxes, utilities, upkeep. She said she thought a contribution of $1,400 a month was more than reasonable. She called it a family rate. I sat with that for a second. $1,400 a month. For a house I hadn't chosen to live in, that I'd moved into partly because my husband had been so enthusiastic about it, that belonged to a family company my husband was a partial stakeholder in a city I'd uprooted myself to come to. I thought about my bungalow in Sudbury, which I was renting out for $1,100 a month. and which increasingly I missed in a physical way, like a missing tooth. I said, "I'll have to think about that." She said she thought it was pretty straightforward actually. That night I asked my husband what he thought. He was quiet for longer than I would have liked. Then he said that his mother had a point, that they couldn't just let the property sit without recouping costs, that 1,400 wasn't bad for a 4-bedroom in North Bay. I asked him whether he planned to contribute to this 1,400, since we were both living there. He said he was already contributing by putting sweat equity into the family business, and that our finances were shared anyway. I pointed out that our finances being shared meant he was also contributing nothing, and that our finances being shared meant that if I paid $1,400 a month in rent to his family, I was effectively subsidizing his parents. He said I was being uncharitable. I called my mom that night. She listened to the whole thing and then said, very calmly, "What does your rental income cover right now?" I told her $1,100 a month coming in, taxes and maintenance running about $300 out. So roughly $800 clear per month going into a separate account I'd kept since before we were married. My husband knew about the Sudbury house. He didn't know about the account exactly, but I'd never hidden it either. It just hadn't come up. "What about the house itself?" she said. I'd had it appraised the previous spring. The Sudbury market had done something unexpected in the years since I'd bought. The bungalow I'd paid $187,000 for was now assessed at $340,000. My mom made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I didn't pay the $1,400. I told my mother-in-law I needed more time to consider it. She took this with visible effort. She started making comments about guests who overstay their welcome, which I heard about secondhand through my husband. She told him she hoped I understood the value of what the family was providing. My husband relayed this information in a tone that suggested he agreed with her. There was a particular evening, mid-November, ice on everything, dark by 4:30 the way it gets up north, when I was working late at the kitchen table and my mother-in-law came by unannounced. She walked through the house checking things, which she'd started doing with less pretense of purpose, and then came and stood in the kitchen doorway and asked if I'd given any more thought to the rent. I said I had. She asked what I'd decided. I said I didn't think it was appropriate for me to pay rent to live in a house that my husband's family was already obligated to maintain, in a city I'd relocated to specifically to support my husband's career, when I was already contributing financially to our household in other ways. She asked what other ways. I told her I owned property in Sudbury that was generating rental income. She said that was nice, but it didn't really address the question. I said I thought it did actually. She left shortly after that. My husband came home an hour later and told me his mother was very upset. I said I understood. He asked why I couldn't just meet her halfway. I asked him what halfway looked like, mathematically. He didn't answer. The next week she brought it up again at a Sunday dinner. His parents' new house, the whole immediate family. His brother and sister-in-law, both sets of grandparents on his father's side. She framed it as a general observation about the importance of everyone contributing to the family. His father nodded. His brother made a joke about freeloaders that I don't think was aimed at me directly but landed close enough that I felt it. My sister-in-law caught my eye across the table and looked away quickly. I excused myself to use the washroom and stood in the hallway for a minute with my back against the wall. I could hear them talking, the comfortable rise and fall of a family that had been a family for decades, and I understood very clearly in that moment that I was not yet inside that circle and might never be, and that the question of rent had become, for my mother-in-law, something larger than money. It was about whether I would demonstrate my willingness to be absorbed. I went back to the table and finished my meal. I did not agree to pay rent. In January I got a call from my tenant in Sudbury. She and her partner had been offered positions in Thunder Bay and were giving 60 days notice. I told her I understood completely. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store in North Bay for about 15 minutes. Then I drove to a coffee shop and called a realtor I'd worked with before. Not to sell, just to talk. She pulled the current comparables in my neighborhood. The house next door, slightly smaller, had sold in October for $365. Mine was in better shape, she thought, conservatively $375 to $390 if I listed in spring. I did not list in spring. What I did instead, and I want to be honest about the fact that this decision did not happen overnight. that it was the product of many small moments accumulating into one clear direction, was start looking at income properties in Sudbury. I had equity. I had the separate account. I had, it turned out, a better credit profile than I'd realized, because I'd been quietly doing everything right for 5 years without paying much attention to what it added up to. In March, I made an offer on a 4-unit residential building on a street I knew well, 10 minutes from where I'd grown up. 2 two-bedroom units, 2 one-bedrooms, all occupied, all under market rent by about 20% with leases expiring in the fall. The asking price was $610,000. My offer was $590 with a 30-day close. It was accepted. I used the equity from my bungalow as part of the down payment structure, which required refinancing. I did not discuss this with my husband in detail beforehand. I told him I was doing some financial reorganization of my Sudbury property. He said, "Sure, yeah, whatever you think," while watching something on his phone. I have thought about that conversation many times since. The close happened on a Thursday. I remember driving home from the lawyer's office, the Sudbury lawyer. I'd driven down and back in the same day, and stopping at a Tim Hortons on the highway and sitting with a large coffee and a plain bagel and thinking, I own a building. I'm 30 years old and I own a building, and nobody in my husband's family has any idea. The summer was tense. My mother-in-law had shifted strategies slightly. She'd stopped asking directly about rent and had started making my husband feel guilty instead, which was more effective. He began coming home from family dinners quiet in a specific way, and I'd learned to read that quiet. One evening he told me that his mother felt disrespected. I asked in what way. He said she'd put a lot of effort into making the house comfortable for us, and that my attitude had been cold. I asked him if he thought I should pay $1,400 a month to live in a house in a city I'd moved to for him. He said it wasn't about the money, it was about respect. I asked him who was supposed to be respecting whom. We didn't fight exactly. We went to our separate corners and were polite to each other for a few days, which was its own kind of fight. His family organized a gathering in August, a long weekend thing at the cottage, extended family, the works. Probably 30 people over the course of 3 days. I went. I brought food. I was pleasant. His mother ran the weekend with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the organizing principle of things, and I watched her work the room and understood, more clearly than I had before, that she was not a cruel person. She was a person who had built something and couldn't imagine that the architecture of her authority might not extend to me. On the Sunday afternoon she cornered me by the dock while everyone else was out on the water. She said she thought we'd gotten off on the wrong foot, and that she hoped we could move past it. I said I hoped so too. She said she still felt that some contribution from me toward the house costs was the right thing. I said I heard her, and that I had a different perspective on it, and that I thought the respectful thing was to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. She said she found my attitude puzzling. I said I could understand that. She said, ultimately, her son had grown up with certain expectations and values around family and contribution. I said that I'd grown up with certain expectations around financial independence and not paying rent to live in someone else's property. There was a long pause. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but assessment. Like she was recalculating something. You know, she said, this house, and everything the family has built, it will all come to him someday, to both of you. I nodded. That's very kind. I just want to make sure you appreciate what you're part of, I said. I do appreciate it, and I hope that someday the family will appreciate what I've brought to it as well. She looked at me for another second. Then she went to refill someone's drink. In September, the leases on my 4 units expired. I raised the rents to market rate, modest but fair increases done properly with the required notice. 3 of the 4 tenants renewed. The 4th moved out and I found a new tenant within 2 weeks. The building was cash flowing. I told my husband about the building in October. We were driving back from a Thanksgiving dinner at his parents', 3 hours in a car, dark highway, the kind of conversation that happens because there's nowhere to go. I told him calmly, in as much detail as I thought was useful, about the property, about how I'd financed it, about what it was generating monthly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When did you do this?" I said March. He said, "You didn't tell me." I said I'd told him I was reorganizing my Sudbury finances. He said that was not the same thing. I said I knew. He said he felt like he didn't know something important about me. I said I understood why he felt that way. I also said, and I meant it, and I want to be clear that I wasn't trying to be cruel, that I had moved to his city, given up the house I loved, relocated my career, restructured my entire life around his, and that in return I'd been made to feel like a guest who hadn't paid her bill. I said the building was mine, that I had bought it with my own money and my own planning, and that I had kept it separate because I needed to know, for my own sanity, that I had something that was entirely my own, that I had not arrived in his family empty-handed, even if they'd assumed otherwise. He didn't say anything for a while. The highway was quiet. I watched the tree line go by in the headlights. Eventually he said, "She's going to find out." I said, "I know." He said, "That's going to be a thing." I said, "I imagine it will be." His mother found out at Christmas. Not from me, from his uncle who was a realtor in the Sudbury area and had apparently seen my name on a document related to the property. He mentioned it at the family dinner with the cheerful obliviousness of someone passing along interesting news, saying he hadn't realized I was a landlord over in Sudbury, saying it admiringly, asking what kind of cap rate I was getting. The table went quiet. My mother-in-law looked at me across the turkey and the cranberry sauce and the good china she brought out twice a year. I looked back at her. "You own a building," she said. "I do," I said. "In Sudbury?" "Yes." "Since when?" "March," I said. "I also own a house there." "You knew about the house." She set down her fork. "And you've been letting us carry a whole property for you." "I've been living in a house with my husband," I said. "We have not been asking your family to carry anything. We pay the utilities. We do the maintenance. We have repeatedly offered to pay for repairs. That's not the same as contributing to the property costs." "I own 2 properties," I said. "If we're talking about assets brought to this marriage, I think I've contributed quite a bit." The room had that very specific quality of people who want to look somewhere else and can't. My father-in-law put his hand over his wife's. My husband was looking at his. My mother-in-law said very quietly, "I want to understand why you kept this from us." I said, "I didn't keep it from you. My finances are my own business," I told my husband. "Beyond that, I didn't feel I needed to make a full accounting of my assets to your family before I'd been deemed to have contributed enough." She said, "It's a very cold way to look at a family." I said, "Asking your son's wife to pay $1,400 a month in rent is also a fairly cold way to look at a family." I'm just the one who said so out loud. My sister-in-law across the table made a very small sound that might have been a laugh. She turned it into a cough. My mother-in-law excused herself. My father-in-law followed. We heard them in the kitchen, voices low and continuous. The rest of us sat there with the food going cold, and my brother-in-law poured more wine for everyone. And his wife asked me something about the Sudbury market in a tone that was deliberately normal. And I answered her, and the dinner continued in a strange, rearranged way, like furniture after a move. On the drive home, my husband said he hadn't expected it to happen like that. I said I hadn't either, exactly. He said his mother was going to need time. I said I understood. He said he wished I'd told him more, earlier, about everything. I said I wished he'd told his mother earlier that her rent demand was unreasonable. We drove for a while in silence. Then he said, "The cap rate thing, what did you tell him?" I said, "I didn't get to answer before everything went sideways." He said, "Is it good?" I said, "It's pretty good, actually." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Okay." It wasn't a resolution. I want to be honest about that. The months after Christmas were complicated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My mother-in-law and I moved around each other carefully, like 2 people in a small kitchen. She did not apologize, I did not apologize. My husband navigated the middle with the slightly harrowed look of someone diffusing something one wire at a time. We went to family dinners, we were civil. Slowly, something shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recalibrated respect. She stopped talking about contribution. She started asking me questions about the properties, occasionally, in a tone that was almost businesslike. In the spring, my husband and I started looking for our own place in North Bay, something that would be ours. We found a semi-detached near the waterfront, needed work, good bones, in our price range, if we were smart about the renovation budget. I drafted the offer. He negotiated with the sellers. We signed together. The day we got the keys, we stood in the empty living room with its dated wallpaper, and its smell of old carpet and its beautiful south-facing windows, and I thought about my mom in Sudbury, in her house that was entirely hers, and about what she'd taught me without ever putting it into words. That you work hard, and you stay quiet, and you keep something in reserve, And you wait for the moment when it matters. And when it matters, you don't yell, you don't make a scene. You just set down your fork, look someone in the eye, and say exactly what is true. That's enough. It has always been enough.